Building the next meta framework for Angular with Analog. Hi, my name's Brandon Roberts. You can follow me on Twitter at Brandon T. Roberts. I tweet out GIFs, I talk about sports, I block people sometimes, but we have a good time there. You can also follow me on YouTube for web development and open source content. I am the creator of Analog.js, also a maintainer on the NGRX project, an Angular GDE and an X champion, which just means I've been around the community for a while. And I work as the engineering lead at OpenSauced. So for this talk, we're going to talk about Vite, of course, is ViteConf. Talk about Analog, and really quickly talk about contributing in the community. So for Vite, we are at ViteConf, and we know that there are many frameworks and meta frameworks out there that have adopted Vite. And by the time you see this video, there may even be another one announced that has built on top of Vite and continues to thrive there. Also wanted to announce that since last ViteConf, Analog has gone 1.0, and we're even up to version 1.8 now and continuing to build out the meta framework and push forward. But the biggest question that we've gotten along the way is, how did we get here? Why does Analog exist? Angular is a framework with SSR already. And so I usually can sum this up in pretty much one word, and it's spite. But seriously, Angular is pretty great also, and we wanted to extend the Angular ecosystem to other places and tools. So Analog is a big part of that. So we use a few things here to kind of build out this vision of building a full stack solution for Angular. Of course, Vite is there as a foundational piece. There's also Nitro, which I'll get into later, and NX. So on the Angular side, Angular has progressed in many ways that allowed a project like Analog to be created with building blocks such as standalone components, which are becoming the default in the future of Angular. Building it with ESBuild, even better support for ESM, and even the Angular framework itself with its SSR story is continuing to improve there. When we started this, it was an integration with Angular and Vite through the Vite plugin for Angular. This allowed us to do things like dynamic imports, where we could import things like Markdown or even just files for file system-based routing, and use the Markdown plugin to generate content from there. There's also Nitro, which is a server toolkit maintained by the UnJS org. And we build on top of what Nitro does to allow things like pre-rendering, supporting different deployment targets, API routes, and extensibility. Because I mentioned before that Nitro and Vite kind of build into this story of a common ecosystem that many frameworks can share. There's also NX, which has generators for applications and routes. It also has executors that use more native commands and can build on top of Vite's native toolchain and even retest, and can automate migrations for things like upgrades and presets that allow you to generate an analog application that's already pre-configured. So some of the features that we've built out over this time was file system-based routing. We've included server-side rendering and improvements there, static site generation, API routes, and even server-only data fetching. So Analog does have a file system-based router where you can do static routes, you can do dynamic routes, you can even group routes with parentheses that don't impact the URL, or even catch-all routes. And these are built on the structure of your file system to allow to build these pages out pretty quickly. As I mentioned before, there's server-side rendering with ngserve, or if you want to use Vite directly, you can do that. Server-side rendering is enabled by default. And we support different platforms such as Node, Edge, and many different deployment providers. A few of the common ones such as Firebase and Netlify, Vercel, and Cloudflare, or even more providers like Xerox. There's also static site generation, or you use ngBuild, and you can set up an array of routes to pre-render. And this supports content routes as well as just dynamic routes within the application itself. For API routes, these are popular in frameworks like Express and Nest.js, where you can define these routes to go along with your application. But here we have these built in using the file system-based syntax also. Here is an example of a source server routes products route on the API, and that's expressed as AP/API/products. There's also server-side data fetching, which you can place these routes alongside your page routes and define these endpoints to fetch data on the server and do other common tasks that you're doing with full stack frameworks. So in this case, I'm defining a load function that can take parameters or query parameters in the request, and you would process your server data there, which could include environment variables, and return some serializable data there. And we also glue these together on the front end where you can inject this data into your component, whether it be connecting through component input bindings with the Angular router or converted this to a signal. All this is integrated into Analog with server-side data fetching. So these are some of the things, some of the features that are in Analog today and helped us build out this solution on top of Vite and Nitro. But the question usually a lot of times comes up is what's next? We've gotten this far, and where are we going from here? So Angular and Analog are together in this and about pushing these ecosystems forward and moving into other ecosystems also. So with Angular, Analog, and Vite, we are, like I said, integrating with these other ecosystems and continue to expand the available tools in these ecosystems. Whether this be Vitest, which we'll talk about in a minute, Storybook, Astro, Qwik, or Playwright. So Vitest, which I'm sure you've heard about during the conference, is a testing framework built on top of Vite. It has a Jest compatible API. It supports snapshot tests, and most recently made a big improvement to the browser testing offering that they have. And use it with the integration with Analog. We have you can use this with existing Angular applications, and even migrate them to Vitest, depending on what you're using there. So to try this out, if you have an existing project, you can install the analog.js/platform package, and you can run the schematic to generate the setup for Vitest against the project. And as I mentioned before, if you're using existing testing APIs, there may be some migrations there, but this will at least get you there up and running to try Vitest against their existing project or even a new project. There's also Playwright, which is an EDE testing framework. They have had component testing around for a while, but it's also looking to incorporate Angular components into that component testing story. And that happens through the Analog plugin, Vite plugin for Angular. So as you can see, the Vite plugin kind of serves as the foundation for a lot of these projects and integrations that we're moving towards with. There's also Storybook. Storybook is a front-end workshop where you can use to build these components and build these components in isolation. And it has integrations with Vite and Vitest. So like I mentioned before, Vite is powering just about every tool that's out there these days. And Storybook is no different in that they integrate well with it, and we can extend this to Angular projects. There's also some experimental parts that we're moving forward with analog also. One of those things is the analog SFC. And this is something that we've been building out in analog itself that has built on top of some of the things that are available in Vite using Vite's transform pipeline. And this allowed us to kind of reimagine what an Angular component looks like in um, in the context of authoring. So here we have a look at a traditional Angular component, and we wanted to look at a different way to author this component, but still achieve the same behavior as it is today. So this is what the analog SFC looks like. You can also try this out today in an analog project. Like I said, still experimental, but we are making some great progress there and looking forward to more feedback there. Also, things that are happening with analog, we're looking into things such as form actions, server-only components, and really focusing on building out a full stack framework with analog and continue these integrations. So with form actions, we are looking to bring the server and client closer together, which makes it things more seamless if you want to incorporate the server into your more into your application. And form actions is an example of that. Here's an example where I'm using a form that's progressively enhanced using the form action directive, and it's will be connected to an endpoint on the server where you can process the data from this form on the server and return data back to a client. In this case, it's just a newsletter form where you can sign up with an email. And then on the server, you can define an action in your server.ts file to process that action and return some data back to the client, whether it be a failure or a redirect, or even just a successful JSON. So those are some of the things we're looking forward to building out in the future with analog. Lastly, I did want to talk about community because we wouldn't be here without the community and contributors that we've had so far. We've had over 100 plus contributors in analog, made it to over 2,000 stars on GitHub, accepted into the first GitHub accelerator cohort, have a growing Discord community, and you can follow Analog.js on Twitter to see what else is going on there. You can also try out Analog directly on StackBlitz. If you want to try out a new analog project, you can go to analog.js.org/new, and it'll spin up an analog project directly in StackBlitz that you can play around with. So to recap, we talked about Vite and its impact on the ecosystem. Talked about analog, how we got here, where we're going next, and how people can get involved in contributing to the project. And I hope you enjoy the rest of ViteConf, and I hope to see you around soon.